if you look, we're now on to TSR-2, aren't we? If you look at that program, we're now in 1996. If the TSR-2 had gone into service, even late, if it had gone into service by 1975, which it should have done, or even earlier, in the early 70s, it would still be in service today. It would have been past a midlife update. It would have had all its electronics and avionics and weapon systems updated to the latest state of the art, because it was a big aeroplane. There was plenty of room for changes of equipment, and of course with the vast advances of microtechnology,
I was going to say, because it had a huge
they're all getting smaller.
Yeah,
and you had
it had a huge equipment bay.
You had a big aeroplane, and I've had people argue this, and they say, well, there you are, total waste of time. You didn't need an aeroplane that big. But what you do is, as you develop microtechnology and you make the equipment smaller, you fill all the empty space with fuel. Make the aeroplane more flexible. It would have been an aeroplane. We'll put it on another context. If you had it in service today, it would have been an aeroplane that had a considerably longer unrefueled range than a Tornado. It would have done the Tornado's tactical work with the same CEP, the same attack accuracy as is required for the Tornado, with terrain-following radar and all the rest of it. It would have done it at the same potential target speed, at low level, and it would have had a 2.5 Mach capability at altitude, which is faster than the Tornado, and that's 30 years later. It was a tremendous breakthrough, and nobody could say, when it was cancelled, nobody could say, well, it will actually do what it was intended to do. But in 24 flights, we achieved such an incredible confirmation of its capabilities that we, the people who were on the job, could see no reason, no argument against it being perpetuated. We thought this airplane is actually going to do what it's intended to do. Nobody knew what the weapon system would do, but if you had the vehicle to carry the weapon system, it was only a matter of time before you got a decent weapon system for it.
You see, I've come across this tremendous conspiracy against the TSR-2, more recently as a book being just published on it, that I read, that the scenario goes that McNamara wanted to promote the F-111.
Yes.
And the TSR-2 was a big competitor.
Yes.
And when the Wilson government came in '64, there was the usual financial crisis, and as a payment for bailing the Brits out, the TSR-2 had to be cancelled. Am I sort of reading your thoughts as well? Or?
Oh, absolutely. We've always believed that, but you'll never bottom that particular argument. I mean, people dodge out from right, left, and centre. If you go and talk to the big names who were involved at the time, they look down their noses and they don't want to pursue the argument. There was something very shady going on behind that.
You see, I was interviewing Dave Morgan in the summer, and he was at Weybridge.
Yes, he was.
At the time of the cancel.
Yes, he was.
And I mean, they were talking about putting another proposal up, a Spey-engined Mirage 4.
That's right, yes.
But he said, can we get out the existing aircraft and line them up and photograph them?
Yeah.
No.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Even the production jigs were zealously destroyed. I mean, it does sound as if that was a hell of a price that government paid.
We have photographs, well, I say we, British Aerospace has photographs, which it's very coy about, showing enormous conflagrations going on outside number 2 hangar at Samlesbury, where these production airframes were dragged out, stuck into a pile on the grass by the perimeter track, and set fire to, and all the magnesium in them going up, like a bomb. And they were being set fire to by the operatives who built the bloody things. I mean, the whole thing was really malign. It was quite extraordinary. But against that, you see, we were just the simple operatives, the engineers and technicians and the air crews and so on. And we could see that this thing we've been striving with for nearly 10 years was so far from being a technical failure. It was a positive and a very great technical success. And it would have provided the Air Force with a unique power for the last 30 years, which it hasn't had. Some often ask me about what it would have done in the Falklands. Well, it would have done a hell of a lot more in the Falklands than we were able to do there. I mean, with a great deal of enormous administrative organisation and a lot of agony and a certain amount of straightforward courage, we got a couple of Vulcans out from this country all the way down to the South Atlantic to drop a stick of bombs across Stanley Runway, which the calculations said would create two craters out of 20 bombs, and it did. What did that prove? I mean, the Arkies went and filled the craters in and went on flying. The TSR-2 would have gone out there with flight refueling, and it would have had a weapon system which would have ensured that we knocked out Stanley on the first strike, and then they could have gone on doing it too.
You see, the terrible irony of all this is that the way was cleared for the F-111, which in turn proved to be a flop.
Well, this was the thing that drove people like myself up the wall, because being in the business, we keep an eye on what other people are doing. I mean, we have a jolly good idea what the Americans were doing with their Century series fighters while we were developing the Lightning. In the same way with the TSR-2, we had a very good technical idea of how they were going with the F-111. And all our best brains at Wharton were saying in the summer of 1964 rather, when we started to first fly the TSR-2, that the F-111 is going to run into immense technical problems. They will solve them, but it'll cost money. The program is going to overrun costs by an enormous amount, and it's going to overrun time by so much that it will probably make it politically unviable. Well, all that happened, but the Wilson government came in and they said, right, we'll cancel TSR-2 and we'll look after the Air Force by ordering the F-111 instead. And there were many people, I'm sure people like Murray and Morgan were advising them not to do that, because they'd lose their shirts. And then 2 years later, they lost their shirts because the F-111 program was going out of sight in terms of time and cost escalation. And so they cancelled and paid cancellation charges and ended up with nothing at all. I mean, it's a disaster, isn't it?
Of course, there were so many other... Peter Twist was telling me the same sort of story with the FD2.
Yes.
When he went down to Bordeaux to do some supersonic flying there, and when it was hangared at the local base down there, the DSO engineers were crawling all over it, and a few years later the Mirage comes out.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's, the development of the FD2, I think.
Right. Well, the concept, absolutely, yeah. Oh, yes. And, of course, the other side of that story, which Peter Twist may have told you, is that totally unlike our government, the French have positively and very heavily supported their industry. For all the years since they came back into the business after World War II, they've supported them in all sorts of ways. I mean, they support the first production run. Then they would support exports by... if they could get a government interested in buying Mirages, they'd say, right, you can have 12 Mirages from our 4th Escadrille or something. They can go straight out there, and then our squadrons could be repaced from the production line as and when they could be built. Not in this country. No concessions at all. And, there's never any help from the government directed towards the military section of aviation, as far as I can see. Dreadful.
Because there are so many. There was a book I read, Project Cancelled, and my view of the aircraft industry is not as an insider at all, but as a reader. And they bring out the story of the Saunders Row SR-53.
Yes.
Which was another one. That was a casualty of Sands, of course, isn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah. That's Derek Wood, yes. Wood. He's made a life study of that.
Was it, the design of the TSR-2, that was carried out all at Wharton, or was something done down at Weybridge?
No, it was a combined operation. I'm not particularly sympathetic to the way it was done. The government decided that, having decided to reverse its decision about supersonic aircraft for the Air Force, it was going to have a supersonic reconnaissance bomber. But this would be, in its judgment, too great a task for any one company, and it would only be undertaken on the basis of two of the strongest companies in the industry combining for the contract, together with a third company to produce the engine. There was a lot of resistance to that idea, but this was the only contract that was available in the military field, and it had to be considered that way. And so eventually, after a lot of discussion in industry, Vickers and English Electric went together into the consortium to be called BAC. They jointly recommended a Rolls-Royce engine. The ministry said no. In their view, the Bristol Olympus was in a better state of development, and that's what was going to happen. So Bristol's came into the consortium with the Olympus. The Olympus turned out to be not a development engine, but an entirely new engine with enormous troubles, which delayed first flight and made it a bit hazardous. That's another story. But as far as the design is concerned, having granted the contract dependent on English Electric and Vickers to combine, they said that the project would be managed by Vickers under Sir George Edwards, and that the design point, that is where the design started, was to be the English Electric P-17, which was a specific design for this particular airplane. So you then, that was a built-in source of friction right from the start. Vickers were going to manage a project to build an English Electric design. The English Electric would say, well, why the bloody hell can't we do it ourselves? And that sort of friction had to be overcome. It was overcome. A maximum effort by the people concerned, which was wholly admirable, got these two organizations together. So eventually you had a system whereby there was a fairly equal division of responsibilities. But basically the answer to your first simple question is the aerodynamics of TSR-2 was largely done by English Electric at Wharton. The avionics, which was the other vital part of the operation, was done by Vickers. I'm trying to remember the name of the chap, an awfully good man. And
Harry Zeffert.
Harry Zeffert, that's right. Marvellous chap. And he got it right, too. The undercarriage, of which the least said the better, was done at Vickers. And various the cockpit was a Vickers design, but it was an even split. Yes.
Good people on. Well, can I sort of structure it a little bit, because I'm interested now to move on from the sad story of the TSR-2 to really the whole change in policy of the industry, i.e. international collaboration.
Right. Well, after the collapse of TSR-2, which had a tremendous effect on industry, I mean, you had all this tremendous surge going on for nearly 10 years to try to produce this airplane. Then it was suddenly cancelled, and the first thing, of course, was redundancies, and all the companies involved had to face up to making many of their best people redundant, which is a very difficult thing to do. Luckily, an awful lot of people, certainly from the English Electric area, went over to America, got themselves good jobs in the aircraft industry there, and have stayed there ever since. Some of them have retired in comfort after working for Boeing for 30 years. All a great loss to this country. And we, at English Electric, were then faced with having no longer got this great project to work on, and the next 10 years of work in the factory had gone. There was a vacuum, and so we had to use the popular word diversify, but we weren't prepared to get into television sets or washing machines, and we had to see how we could do it best. And in the process, a development occurred which proved to be a very, very satisfying thing to do. We had, on the basis of the successful development of the Lightning with increased fuel, which we spoke about earlier, we have been able to interest the Saudi Arabians in the Lightning as a defense fighter. Saudi Arabians were interested in making their defense system supersonic. It was totally subsonic. The Americans have been out there at great strength to try to get in, but nevertheless the British apparently were thought to have a chance, and we put a great deal of effort into it. We got a contract going, supported by the British government, with help in areas where we needed it, to supply the Saudi Arabian Air Force with Lightning fighters, Strike Master jet trainers, and flying training. That started in 1965, almost immediately after the cancellation of TSR-2. So that provided an area where we could turn effort and highly qualified people into it. That was only just seemed to us a stopgap. It turned out to be something quite different. 30 years later, that program, now known as Al Yamamah, is still going on with Saudi Arabia, now with Tornado fighters, and has been worth many billions of pounds in exports to this country, and has 3 decades running been recorded as Britain's biggest export program ever. So that was a satisfactory development. Well, now, the preoccupation in 1965, 66, and then on, with getting into Saudi Arabia, provided that bolstering or filling in of the vacuum caused by the loss of TSR-2. But there had to be ongoing future work, and the British government were interested or supported English Electric's interest in it was called BAC by then, in collaborating with the French on a tactical fighter. English Electric were told that they could talk to Breguet Aviation, who had a development in mind for their own Air Force. The development we had in mind for our Air Force was not quite the same, because the Air Staff wanted a supersonic capability. The French didn't. There was a lot of discussion. It went on for about a year, but eventually a compromise was reached. And I emphasize that word compromise because it's been perfectly clear, well, it was from the beginning, it's subsequently become very clear that any international cooperation you ever do can probably be justified, but for financial and for stability of the contract reasons, but it can never be anything other than a compromise, because neither side is ever going to produce the ideal thing for its own purposes. Anyway, cut a long story short, we went in with Breguet to design and build the Jaguar. The Jaguar is a fine little tactical airplane, limited to one purpose, and as has been proved in recent operations, particularly in the Gulf, extremely satisfactory, extremely effective at it. But it is a compromise, and for a long time the Royal Air Force regarded the Jaguar as they described it, as a pussycat. They said that it needed reheat for taxiing, which wasn't exactly true. But the Air Force always takes a long time to get used to the idea it's got a new airplane. And in the recent Gulf War, they had, I think, something over 600 sorties with 100% reliability and extremely high target accuracy. And the Chief of the Air Staff after the Gulf War described the Jaguar as the most efficient airplane, most cost-effective airplane on the inventory. So that had been achieved. As a result of that, we in English Electric, and I suppose in this country as a whole, learnt a lot about international collaboration. It has its difficulties, but we had the experience of collaboration between the aircraft industry of the Northwest and the aircraft industry of the Southeast at Vickers and Wharton, and the clash of interests that went on then. So probably we had some experience to go on. Working with the French, was something else. And we found that, I think it's best described as one of our engineers came back from one of these interminable meetings down in wherever it was, in at Easter or somewhere, saying there's no problem in getting on with the French as long as you do exactly what they want.